Greetings, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So in this video I'm going to talk about the Armenian Genocide. It's a highly contentious topic, and I wish to underscore at the outset that nothing in this video is remotely anti-Turkish. I don't want any Turkish person to be mistreated, or any person of any ethnicity or of any religion to be mistreated on account of that. So just trying to objectively discuss what happened to Armenians between the years 1915 and 23 in the Ottoman Empire. This is not a stick to beat any nationality or faith, and it's not intended to be offensive to anyone. Just try to objectively discuss a very thorny subject. And some people who claim that an Armenian genocide did not even occur. I don't think very many people dispute that huge numbers of Armenian civilians were killed in the Ottoman Empire in those years. There's plenty of room for discussion of just how many that was. It's the figure is unclear. The exact number is never going to be arrived at. But there are those who claim that it wasn't a genocide. The late Norman Stone amongst them, and Professor Stone saying so because I think he's claiming that the Ottoman government didn't order it, or it wasn't on a gross enough scale, something like that. So the 25th of April 1915 is usually regarded as the commencement of the Armenian genocide, if indeed genocide is the apposite term, because there were the large-scale arrests of Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. So the Armenians mainly resided in Armenia, unsurprisingly, but there are about as many Armenians outside Armenia as there were in it. And of course, the Armenian homeland straddled the Ottoman-Russian border. Okay, it's because some Armenians lived within the Russian Empire that they were saved, because Russia was on their side. I think of the situation of Armenia. For centuries, it was surrounded by Muslim powers, the Ottoman Empire and Iran, formerly Persia, Azerbaijan, another Muslim country, sometimes as part of the Ottoman Empire, sometimes it was part of Persia, sometimes it was independent, divided into various emirates. Armenia's other neighbour is Georgia, but Georgia is part of the Iranian Empire for centuries prior to its acquisition by Russia, and then there was Russia. So no wonder the Armenians and the Russians are very tight, because the Russians were their only defenders, but for that they feared that they would be overrun, the only other Christian power in the region. And the other Caucasian peoples of the Caucasus, perhaps I should say, the Ingushetians, the Dagestanis, the Chechens and so forth, Circassians are Muslims. So I'm certainly not anti-Muslim, and there doesn't need to be any animus between people of different religions, but in bygone centuries and even today, sadly, unfortunately, there sometimes is animosity between different ethnic and religious groups, and it's inter-ethnic asperity that I despise, and I always seek to combat that spirit. Anyhow, the Young Turks were ruling the Ottoman Empire at the time, or to give them their proper name, the Ottoman Committee for Union and Progress, who'd seized power in 1908. Now, the Sultan Mehmet VI was still nominally ruling the Ottoman Empire, but he seldom left Istanbul, spending most of his time in Dolmabahce Palace, right beside the Bosphorus, occasionally in Topkapi Sarai, the older palace. So a trio of men, the three pashas, Enver, Jamal and Talat, were ruling. Turks in those days were mostly known mononymically. So if you had to identify an individual, you'd say, let's say, Cem, the son of Rauf, and Suada, naming his father and his mother. And it was very rare to find someone with the same name and the same father of the same name and a mother of the same name. So minority people had surnames, middle names, but Ataturk in the 1930s, he insisted that all Turks take names. They often took names of places, of their trade, names meaning like Iron Hand or Great Deeds, gold and things like that. Anyway, I digress. So the Armenians had mostly been quite favourable to the Young Turks, thinking that they would represent an improvement in the lot of the Armenians. It could scarcely get worse. The Armenians had dhimmi status within the Ottoman Empire, as in were legally discriminated against, had to pay higher taxes and so on, as did those who were not Sunni Muslims, because the Turks, the great majority of them are Sunni Muslims. Not as many people spoke Turkish back then as they did now, even in Turkey proper. I remember the Ottoman Empire at the time included, well, a tiny bit was now Greece, but at that time still a tiny bit was now Bulgaria, but Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, both coasts of Saudi Arabia, a part of Yemen, and obviously in bygone centuries it included much of the Middle East, North Africa, you know, the northern coast of the Black Sea. But I go on. So Armenians had spread throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond, but obviously heavily concentrated in the very east of Anatolia, adjacent to what's now the Republic of Armenia. But there had been Armenian prejudice for centuries. There'd often been fighting between Turks and Armenians. Many people in Anatolia spoke Kurdish or other languages. It's not till the 1930s the Turkish government very successfully promoted Turkish, and various ethnic minorities became Turkified, ceased to perceive themselves as belonging to other groups, and started to speak exclusively Turkish. Their other identities were discouraged and suppressed. Armenians, you can usually tell them from the Ian suffix to their surname. So there have been wars in the Caucasus and the Balkans leading up to this, and in fairness, many Muslims have been driven out of the Caucasus by the Russians. Some Chechens, Circassians and so forth had chosen to leave. They shifted to Turkey, and so sometimes vengeance was wreaked upon the Armenians, perceiving them as Russian stooges, as fifth columnists. And of course there was some truth in that. That doesn't mean that the entire nation deserves to be wiped out. So in 1914 the First World War began. Russia and the Ottoman Empire were enemies of each other, and of course the Russian Empire was to the east of Turkey, bordering it what's now Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so fighting commenced there. So the Armenians were then conscripted into labour units to be digging trenches, loading and unloading trains and wagons and things like that. Many of these people who were doing this forced labour were eventually slain by the Ottoman Empire. So there, from April 1915, the mass expulsion of Armenians from their historic home in eastern Anatolia began, and many died whilst it was underway. They were on these forced marches through the blistering heat of summer into Syria without sufficient nourishment, water, anything like that, rest, shade. This is including geriatrics and babes in arms. And some people directly killed, as shot dead, stabbed, locked up in buildings, burnt, sometimes doctors poisoning them, things like that. So this is not saying that Turkish people are bad or mostly bad, or even that most of them approved of it. I don't know. I've not seen any opinion polls. Certainly a few did. And of course there were gallant Turks who saved Armenian people. You might say that Turkish civilians were also massacred in this war. I'm not aware of that. You might well be correct. So excuse my ignorance. Tell me about that. If you can demonstrate that that's true, I will accept that without hesitation. I'm not suggesting that all Turks are bad, far from it. Nor am I suggesting that all Armenians are good. No nationality is all good or bad. Goodness or badness, these are individual things. So not try to put a blood libel on the Turkish nation or make anyone remotely anti-Turkish. There are many splendid things about Turkish culture. I like it from its architecture to its cuisine to its Turkish baths, and you see how it's a melange of cultures. There's been this synthesis or syncretism between Turkish and Greek culture for a long time. Anyway, so people may say this is a security measure, and it's true that some of the Armenians would welcome the Russian army. Who can blame them? Remember, there have been large-scale massacres of Armenian civilians 20 years earlier, so they knew what sort of mass slaying would be visited upon them again. So for very survival, they might have felt that they needed to fight and they needed Russia to champion them or they'd be wiped out. Well, they were correct. So these large-scale deportations were fairly common at the time, of civilians locking them up, but these were worse than really any other civilian deportations around the early 20th century into the late 19th century. Nothing like it until the Second World War took place, the sheer level of death. Now, people talk about 800,000 Armenians being killed in this. That's about the lowest figure, about 1.5 being the million. Now, that 800,000, all right, you might argue some of that was natural wastage. There'll be some mortality in any civilian population. You take a population of a few million, between the years 1915 and 23, would some die anyway? Yeah, they would, from cancer, from heart attacks, from all sorts of accidents. I accept that. So you could argue the figure is a little bit lower. Not all of these deaths are attributable to the deportations, but most of them are. Okay, even people would have died in that 8-year period, many of them dying sooner. Some people ill anyway, all right. but forced marches are what finished them off. So this plea and mitigation only works to a limited extent. And the lack of food and water, you can say, oh, that's because of the exigency of war and supplies not getting through because enemy destroying this and that. And again, that is not a very effective argument. It's fairly disingenuous because these people were deep inside Ottoman territory. So the enemy were not affecting very much what was going on in terms of the transportation, what was being moved, comestibles and munitions. So some Armenians found refuge in the mountains of Syria or Lebanon, fled to Cyprus. So as I pointed out, the Ottoman government, they applied to New York Life in 1918 for payouts on life insurance policies from thousands of Armenians whom they had killed, saying they were unable to find the heirs and successors of these people. So what makes it absolutely clear that it was a genocide is that it was not just against people, it was deliberately razing to the ground Armenian churches or sites of cultural significance, so to try to erase from history their existence. And unfortunately, there's anti-Armenian prejudice in Turkey even to this day, sometimes a graffiti seeking to glorify the Armenian genocide and call it a cleansing, as though they purge themselves of something filthy, which is obviously a viciously racist trope. It's one of the standard racist memes, is saying these people are dirty and so we must rid ourselves of them. And is there anti-Turkish prejudice amongst Armenians? Yeah, you bet. I'm not saying that all or even most Armenians are like this, but unsurprising that's going to happen. It's wrong. I wish it didn't happen, but sadly many people react like that. Okay, if something horrific is done to my people, I might be so furious about that, my blood is boiling, I want to hit back. And I don't care if that individual is guilty or innocent, just them in general. Now, if I can't get a guilty one, I'll get an innocent one because people view it as being collective guilt. It's wrong, that attitude. It's asinine, but I'm sorry, it's oh so human, it happens. So it's detestable. Try and rise above that, and that's what civilization is. To be more humane, to be compassionate, and not to put people into categories like that and to penalise the innocent. Okay, so you can see the Ottomans saying, well, these Armenians are untrustworthy, they are traitors, they're going to help the Russians, so we have to punish all of them. You see, it's that sort of attitude you could get on either side. And yeah, it's true that some Armenians did embrace the Russian army and want their help. I don't blame them. You can see why. Perhaps if they'd been treated with a modicum of justice, they wouldn't have felt that way. There are other Christian minorities within the empire who didn't behave that way. So it was people of the Turkish ethnicity who mainly did the killing, and I'm not saying that most Turks, even at the time, were responsible for this. And some Kurdish people too did it happily. And again, I'm not blaming Kurds in general. I don't want anyone to feel insulted, all right? And you might say, what about you? You're Irish people. Irish people have done dreadful things, or you're British people have done dreadful things. And yes, that's true. And I'm very willing to talk about it and post a comment, ask me to make a video about the darkest chapters in the history of the British Isles, about abominable crimes that have been visited on other people. And I will discuss that willingly. So it's not trying to point the finger or say that my people are morally superior or something like that. So no nation is either good or wicked, right? These guilt are usually an individual thing. So I point out there are righteous Turks who saved Armenians. And we know about the Armenian genocide. We know so much from very candid reports written by German and Austro-Hungarian army officers who are there, from the diplomats of neutral countries such as Sweden, and from American diplomats, because of course the United States remained at peace with the Ottoman Empire throughout the First World War. Henry Morgenthau was the US ambassador to the Sublime Porte, and he wrote very lengthy reports about this and had some completely frank discussions with Ottoman officials who didn't feel one bit ashamed about this and unblushingly acknowledged to him precisely what was going on. It was on such a gigantic scale that it was impossible to conceal, but nor did they even attempt to disguise what was going on. So, as I say, some people, their lives were spared if they were married to a Turkish person or they converted to the Islamic faith. Other people, that was not enough to save them. So Raphael Lemkin, the one who invented the word for genocide in 1943, he was a Jewish scholar from some Eastern European country, later a US citizen, a man who was conversant in a baker's dozen of languages. Anyway, when he came up with that, he did this particularly with the Armenian genocide in the forefront of his mind. That was the one that moved him to write it. Of course, the Holocaust was in full swing at the time. So you may have heard of Ataturk or Mustafa Kemal, as he originally was, that Turkish army officer who won the Battle of Gallipoli and later rose to be President Generalissimo of Turkey, founder of the Turkish Republic, someone who's adulated by all Turks. His image is ubiquitous throughout Turkey, and there's an Ataturk street and square in virtually every Turkish city and throughout the Turkic world. He's someone who's honoured as far afield as Pakistan and Romania. Anyway, Ataturk, he acknowledged that it was entirely true and said it was deeply shameful that these barbarous crimes had been committed on the Armenian people. And at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman government itself opened prosecutions against those who'd committed these abominable offences against morality as well as law. And so Ottoman court-martials found that this had happened, and indeed reached the conclusion, you can see this is published, that the Young Turks had aimed to exterminate the Armenian people. So that trio, Enver, Talat and Jamal, they're all found guilty on these counts in absentia. Anyway, they were fled, and some of them were fighting in Central Asia. One of them was killed in a skirmish there, I can't remember who. They had this idea of founding a sort of Turania, a huge Turkic nation, Turkey and the other Turkic-speaking nations, uniting with Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, right back into Central Asia. And some of them were there towards the end of their lives. So some of the top Ottoman officials and army officers who were responsible for these appalling crimes were arrested by the British, taken as prisoners of war to Malta, and were due to stand trial. But they were eventually released in exchange for Britons who'd fallen into Ottoman hands, which is odd because, of course, of the armistice, all Allied prisoners of war who were in captivity in the Ottoman Empire should have been immediately released. The armistice was one-sided because the Allies had won, whereas Ottomans who were in Allied hands were not to be let out. Not until the Treaty of Sèvres was signed in 1920. And at the Treaty of Sèvres, of course, the Ottoman state, and it was still officially the Ottoman Empire in 1922, stated that yes, these crimes had taken place, and agreed to hold tribunals to bring people to account. They must face justice, those who had committed these huge-scale crimes, perhaps not blaming so much the lower-down soldiers who'd simply followed orders, and that Nuremberg defence worked until Nuremberg, but the higher-ups, those who did have discretion, who could have given the order, or could not have given the order, but chose to do so, where they were ordered to deport someone, but they went further, say, no, kill them, and things like that. Anyway, so the trouble is, there's a code of the Ottoman, it's not the Ottoman, sorry, the Turkish criminal law, which says that we mustn't insult Turkishness, and this is interpreted very broadly to say that anyone who talks about this is insulting Turkey, which is, of course, preposterous. And now I know some people could sometimes frame it in a way which is upsetting and insulting to Turkish people. I mean, I know that's nothing compared to hundreds of thousands of your ethnicity being killed. And not many people actually deny that large numbers of Armenian civilians were killed. There are a few, and then there are others who say, yeah, we did it, and we're very proud of it. So there we are. So unfortunately, a completely free discussion of this very vexed and painful chapter of Middle Eastern history is not possible in Turkey, particularly under President Erdogan, who seems to be a very blinkered hyper-nationalist. So there are dozens of legislatures around the world which have voted to recognise the Armenian Genocide for what it was, and indeed the United Nations has done so as well. Now, I don't believe that legislatures should do so, but anyway, the fact they've done so shows just how widespread the acknowledgement of this is. And the Turks were irate when France acknowledged this in, I think it was 2011. And so they then brought a case to the United Nations saying that France had committed genocide in Algeria in the late 50s into the early 60s. Now, it's true the French army was fighting La Front de Libération Nationale there, an Algerian separatist organisation. And the French army didn't just kill enemy fighters. Large numbers of civilians were killed in that. Sometimes it's a bombing raid and civilians are killed by accident. The French Air Force sometimes reckless about this, but sometimes it was purposeful. Soldiers knowing precisely what they're doing, taking out civilians when they have time to calm down, not just seeing red, but deliberately killing large numbers of civilians. And indeed that did happen. Although that's by the by, that's not what we're talking about right now. But I'm not saying that the Turkish government statements are always false, or their accusations are always bogus against other countries. So was it systematic? I'd say that it was. Was it directed by the government? I'd say that it was. And yes, okay, commanders on the ground sometimes went further than they were required to. And when they were only ordered to deport, actually killed people. So yeah, not every killing was ordered by the government, and not everyone in the government was in favour of this. But as Hitler notoriously said, who now remembers the Armenians, that he felt that he could get away with genocide and nobody would care 20 years hence, because the Armenians seem to have been largely forgotten by 1939. So I acknowledge that, yeah, some Turkish people, some Muslims of other ethnicities in the Ottoman Empire were sometimes killed, civilians killed on purpose by their enemies, which of course is abhorrent. I don't want anyone to be killed on that basis. I'm not a pacifist, but I recognise one soldier killing his enemy in combat, that's different from civilians who should never be targeted. But I'm realistic, and I realise that accidentally civilians will be killed. You're firing at a building with their enemy soldiers in there, and you kill some of the enemy soldiers, but some of the bullets might kill some civilians there as well. Things like that. A plane drops a bomb, destroys an enemy target, but beside it is a civilian building, and some of the civilians get killed too. That's different from deliberately killing civilians, knowing them to be civilians, and that's what went on in this case. As I said, sometimes they were killed directly, sometimes indirectly, but the Ottoman state didn't seem to regard that as undesirable. In fact, they wanted it. So anyway, where's Armenia now? It's an independent country again, landlocked, sandwiched between Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Iran. Obviously, they're in a frozen conflict with Azerbaijan. The Turks and the Azerbaijanis are largely the same people. Their language is mutually comprehensible. Was virtually the same until the 1930s, till language reform in the 1930s, when the Turkish language was purified supposedly and purged of many of its Arabic and Persian loanwords, which have survived in Azerbaijani, and the Turks took French words to replace them. The Azerbaijanis sometimes took Russian words. So one of the different distinctions is, of course, that Turks are mostly Sunni Muslim, mostly secular, and the Azerbaijanis are again largely Shia Muslim, but again mostly secular, Muslim in name only. But they have a lot in common. They regard themselves as brother nations. So Azerbaijan fully supports Turkey on this. And it's true that in the 1991 to 94 war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, hundreds of Azerbaijani civilians, possibly thousands of Azerbaijani civilians, were massacred by the Armenian army. As I say, not doing this, not talking about killing people by accident, but doing it knowing precisely what they were doing in many of these cases. Yeah, some Armenian civilians killed by the Azerbaijani army too, not on quite the same scale. Is that because the Azerbaijani army was more ethical, possibly, or just because they were being defeated, had fewer Armenian civilians under their control? That's that. It doesn't make it acceptable, tit for tat. They killed one of ours, so we're going to kill one of theirs. It always happens, but it's still morally wrong. So I'm just trying to be very fair-minded, very even-handed in discussing this, which I know is a highly sensitive topic. The Armenian Genocide, that's what it was. I can't see what else you could call it apart from a genocide. And these arguments claiming that, yes, hundreds of thousands of Armenian civilians were killed by the Ottoman army, but that wasn't genocide. These appear to me to be unsustainable. This was not an accident like a famine with a flood or a drought or some blight of crops, or the not the government failing to provide relief or something like that. It's not a deportation which people died by accident because of harsh conditions. There was a bit of that, but often it was direct killing. So there we are. That's what the Armenian Genocide is. I don't call for the Turkish Republic to do anything in particular, to apologise for that, to pay compensation. Many people would like that. I'm just telling the plain truth about it without seeking to advance a political agenda, score points, or make anyone seem bad or make anyone seem good. So because these things are so freighted with emotion, it's very difficult to discuss this and get people to tranquilly acknowledge what happened. So that is the historical truth of it.